Hello, I hope all of you had a good morning and excited for this interesting afternoon that we are going to have. Um, I, I think most of us are already know about new planning and is joining for at least the second time. But to start with, I welcome everybody to the 7th event of the new planning. We are talking about the roles of planning and how to integrate spatial planning and design with society. Our partners for this event is University of Groningen and Parkhaus Zwijger. We had last two meetings as same online meetings, but this time we tried to do it in a hybrid format. And to be able to discuss with the panel in a physical manner at Parkhaus Zwijger and live streaming the session with the audience. That would have been technically much more better and presentation wise much nicer. But unfortunately, with the Monday's press conference, we had to change the whole format, and due to the necessary restrictions regarding COVID-19, the event now is being organized completely online. Considering the traveling and meeting, we took this decision with our partners, and we have informed all our speakers and panelists to join digitally. I hope all of you are feeling safe and healthy and sitting at your home and not meeting a lot of people. So starting with the session today, I'm myself very interested because we are discussing a very fundamental question today, that how with different urgencies that we have always been talking during the whole new planning dialogue, how this changes the practice of planning and how this changes the roles of planner and designers in our society. So I'm Alankrita Sarkar. I'm working with Deltametropolis Association, and I'm the project leader for new planning. I welcome you once again. We are being many eminent speakers from practice and academia are here for our panel discussion today. And most of the part will be moderated by Paul Gerritsen, the director of Deltametropolis Association. Paul, maybe you can say hello to everybody.
Hi, also very welcome from my part. I'm excited about the conversation we're about to have, so I'm looking forward to it.
So our partner, Groningen University, will be helping us with some moderation part towards the end of our session. We will introduce them after the coffee break, and they are also our panel members, so they will anyhow be introduced by Paul during the panel discussion. To have a smooth session today, there are few instructions, and for just a bit more practical information for you. So because this is a digital setup, we have to keep it as crisp and short as possible. So this is a shout out to all the speakers and moderators that let's try to keep an eye on the time so that we can manage to finish the whole session. The second point is we want it to be a very interactive session, but it will become chaotic if everybody starts speaking at once. So because of the digital situation, it is better that all of us are muted most of the time, unless and until you're asking any question. Of course, the chat box is always open for questions, so you can put your questions up in the sidebar at the chat box, and we will be answering to them during the discussion or after the discussion. The most important part is we want to have the first part as a panel discussion. So we just want to see the panels interacting with each other. So during the first part, it would be better that all of us have switched off our videos. But during the audience interaction session, which is after the coffee break, please put your videos on. because we would like to see all the participants at once. During the breakout rooms, we are dividing ourselves into 5 groups. Please do not press leave the meeting button. We will make sure that you are sent to the right breakout room and you're back to the main session afterwards. Lastly, we have already advised you in the information emails that please put your Zoom names as your name and organization. So it would be great if you can do that now, if you haven't done it already. That way, it would be easier for the speakers and moderators to ask you the question and direct the right questions to you. At last, please note that the session is being recorded and being streamed on YouTube. Malvika, my colleague, will be available throughout the session, helping you through the chat box for any technical questions that is needed. So let's look at the program for today. Just give me 1 minute. Just give me 1 minute. So the program is divided into 2 parts. First is the panel discussion, and the second is the breakout sessions, as I already mentioned. I'm supposing that all of you know the new planning, know about the new planning dialogue already, but let's do a quick check. Let's go to Mentimeter and see that how many times have you joined the session. So you just have to go to menti.com, put this code 6750012, or you can also scan the QR code. So if I see it correctly, most of you are joining for the first time. I'm glad that this subject interests you so much that you started you have joined the dialogue now. There are some people who have joined few more times, and there is one person who has joined more than 4 times. I'm really glad to see that. But I don't think all of you have answered it. So this is open. You can keep answering it in upcoming few minutes. But just to give you an idea, the new planning paradigm is a combination of 4 overlapping phases: the research, dialogue, publication, and community of practice. The project aims to stimulate a change in the practice of spatial planning to ensure a more sustainable and more inclusive development. We discuss various scales and subjects to answer the big question. The big question, how to effectively plan for the big challenges. We had 6 successful events out of 8 in the series, discussing the urgencies in planning, defining the ambitions, the national planning as a vision, the regional scale and formalization, the city and decision making. And the most recent one was values in planning. So how the global values are being translated in the local planning system. Today is the 7th one, and after this one, we are just left with the last one, which is on 21st of October, about the role of mega regions and Eurodelta. We'll be organizing that as a side event of European Week of the Regions and Cities 2020. The registration link is in the chat box, so you can register already for the next one. So before we get into the topic for today, I would like to ask all of you the next question, that what do you expect from new planning? You can go to Mentimeter and menti.com. The link, Malvika is putting the link on the on our chat box, so you can take the link from there and answer to that. Did you all get the link? Is it working for all of you? I can see some couple of answers coming in already. So I'll share my screen. This is a really interesting question, which is my role. I'm not sure who has put it, but I am really hoping that by end of today's discussion, we get an answer about this. Paul and Terry, I'm counting on you to give an answer at the end on this question, which is my role. Another interesting question, what if planning fails? Maybe some of our speakers will be able to answer this towards the end. Of course, we are already have started making this new community of new planning to get inspired, to understand new directions and tools, sharing each other's work, and finding the radical new ways to find ways forward. Encourage paradigm shift. Super interesting. So that's good to hear from you that these are the expectation, and we have already been discussing these things. And in our upcoming session, as well as the publication and community of practice, we would like to answer these questions more. Particularly for this session, our partners, University of Groningen, has prepared a video showing the urgencies of planning and why this is a code red right now. So maybe we can watch all of us together. I hope all of you can hear it. enthusiastic are we now to have a nice, interesting discussion? On that note, I would like to welcome Paul Gerritsen, Director of Deltametropolis Association and the initiator of New Planning Dialogue. First, to react on the audience response, the video, and just to introduce today's topic. Paul.
Well, thank you, Alengrita. Yeah, quite a dramatic entry like that with a video stating the Netherlands a little bit as a paradise lost, and how are we going? I don't know if it makes sense to really go into the in the video as such, but it sets the stage definitely, and also the stage setting. I think it would be very nice that in the first panel to discuss this stage setting. When preparing this this dialogue, I had to think back of an article written by Rem Koolhaas in 1994, which was subsequently published in OMA's and Bruce Mau's work SML-XL, Whatever Happened to Urbanism, and it describes actually the point when needed most, when cities are doubling or tripling within years or decades rather than centuries, that actually urbanism as a skill is absent. He argues that this absence is actually ingrained in urbanism as a profession itself, and perhaps there's some sort of similarity when we're thinking about planning. Planning, as in spatial planning, shares a little bit of that fate. So, particularly, of course, in places like the Netherlands, where space is so scarce that planning really becomes or is felt to be of key importance, and every square meter has a certain purpose, or at least imagined purpose. That we feel that at moments when, particularly after such a dramatic video, that at the moment when it's needed most, the tools and traits of planning, as you would imagine, as a skill that is possible to look a little bit ahead, that is able to think of strategies and concepts to cope with these big challenges, that tries to balance the needs and the available resources. You would imagine that planning at that day and age, so at this day and age, would be available and be accepted as an important voice. Obviously, there is a certain morbid irony here at the moment, where we feel that actually that there is, in terms of spatial planning, we're at the moment where it's least seen as a solution. Of course, we've seen a dramatic change in political landscape from the period when this strong spatial planning was installed in the Netherlands in post-war times. Economic liberalization, changes in socio-economic circumstances as well. So it's also hard to imagine that the same kind of role and same kind of qualities and skills would fit to this day and age. However, at the moment, it's interesting to see in the Dutch press, there's new calls for reinstalling a coordinating ministry, and we've heard of pressure groups who are already preparing to reinstall this kind of central coordination after the coming election. So it's interesting to see that this kind of debate is coming back, re-centralization of planning. But perhaps this is actually not the right approach, and I think this is the discussion I would like to have today. And it's very nice that we can also welcome today someone to participate in the panel that actually first brought up this idea. Ruud Hopner of the Veld Academy, both a social scientist and architect and urbanist, so interesting combination. Last year in the third planning dialogue series, told the audience actually that the planning skills and capacities should be made available for all. So it should not be limited to a small group of professionals who are thinking ahead and coming up with strategies, but should actually be shared as a quality with a much larger group of societal players. And in that respect could gain much bigger traction in society and have a bigger effect than just a small group of very special so-called people who could define the roads ahead. Annette Kempenaar from Rijksuniversiteit Groningen added to that in our conversation while preparing this this conversation of this afternoon, that in this process, and I think it has been addressed by a lot of people recently, it's very important that spatial design as a quality is added to that. Imagining the future, thinking of images of how this future could be positively perceived, what kind of solution could come out, is something that allows for taking up and taking with us large parts of society. And of course, such a role of imagining the future and creating images that have this quality requires a lot of practice and skills that are perhaps not as easily be transferable. And of course, these are qualities that are only developed after a long period of time. And so I think it's interesting to see what kind of skills we can address that have this quality of being transferable, and which are not, which require some sort of professionality in the context of the big, large, monumental, you could say, challenges that come forward out of the issues at hand, primarily, of course, climate change and everything that follows suit. In the first panel, we would like to focus on the circumstances of planning in this day and age, and we have a very nice panel to have this discussion with, and I would like to introduce them to you. First off is Professor of Urban Development and Management at TU Delft, Ellen van Buren. Her research focuses on concepts, instruments, and principles of integrated area-oriented development in contemporary urban development. And I think that is very interesting that she is not only an academic, but also is part of numerous advisory committees and advises government at the moment as well. Also joining is the first special envoy of international water affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I think a role created especially for him. He was one of the principal engineers, you could say, of Rebuild by Design, the post-Sandy process of rethinking the devastated areas in North America after Hurricane Sandy and all the design that was involved in that process. And of course, he has a long history in the Netherlands on numerous skills coping with a wide variety of issues. Henk Ovink, so very welcome that you're joining. Also joining in this panel is Marloes van der Veen. She's working for the Annexis Group. Basically, the Annexis Group is responsible for the energy infrastructure part of it in the Netherlands, and she's in charge of the corporate strategy and development and monitoring as an advisor to the executive board on sustainability. Then from the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, we have Christian Zuidema, assistant professor of spatial planning. He's involved in many research projects, most notably focusing on the topic of integrated energy planning. And we have another Christian Lamker, assistant professor, sustainable transformation and regional planning at Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. As a last addition to the panel, we have Janne-Marie de Jonge, and I especially asked her to help me reflect a little bit on what all of you said. Janne-Marie de Jonge, of course, is a well-known player in the field of spatial planning and design in the Netherlands. A landscape architect, has written her PhD on regional design and research by design and its qualities in landscape architecture, and she is a partner at Wing. So all of you, very welcome. If you can, please turn on your videos, and I can see you. Let's see if I have everyone here. Great to see most of you. Henk, I'm also there. You are. So the central question of the first panel is really what changes in planning in the light of the big issue of climate change and the subsequent crises that follow from that, and the big transitions that are needed to sustain prosperous living, particularly in a country like the Netherlands, densely populated in a delta area. And there are, of course, as we know, many deltas in the world which have this this quality of being very densely populated and while at the same time under pressure from direct pressure from climate change. So maybe as a first first opening statements, I would like to ask Christian Zuidema to start up the conversation. So please, can you reflect on that main question, the changing roles of a planner in this day and age?
Wow. Well, thank you, and good to see you all. You're basically asking me the very nice question, how we as planners are going to save the Netherlands from whatever is coming at us. So that's a big one. But to kick off the conversation, and I think we can probably all add elements to that. For me, one of the big capacities as planners have is the capacity to think in an integrated fashion. I think we probably all recognize that in many ways, when you're discussing with people who are accustomed to their own sectoral interests, that they are not necessarily people that immediately start to think about how does everything connect to each other. And the thing that I've noticed in a lot of project meetings, but I've also seen that, for example, when I'm guiding student groups that are interdisciplinary, the ones that tend to focus on, yeah, but this relates to that, and that relates to this. That is a capacity that planners have. And I think that kind of means that we should not necessarily think of planning as one of those elements that need to be taken into account when approaching those challenges. I think planning can be one of those domains that can really help to connect all kinds of challenges to each other. So for me, if we start to think about the challenges that we have when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to energy, climate adaptation, biodiversity, there are concepts, there are ideas in how these can work together. But the kind of people that might be able to really help envision what that could mean in a certain situation, and also who could translate those visions into how might we be able to do that, I would say planners can really play a role in that. So I would like to start with that, but as you will understand, it is probably a bit more than that.
Yeah, as we saw in the chat, the credits for the opening video are with you. You made it quite dramatic in that sense, and also that's why probably this first question is directed to you in such a way that I'm wondering, like, this is such a monumental shift that actually it feels a little bit overstated to think that planners with this kind of quality of integrating would be able to play such a pivotal role in that.
Well, maybe to just very simply add to that, I see in quite a bit of the debates the tendency that planning is being considered as one of those constraints to allow for things to happen. I mean, I work a lot on the topic of energy, and that's a good example of that. But also when you talk about air pollution, or when you talk about agriculture, planning is often considered as it's a regulatory frame that kind of prevents certain things from happening. And I think in practice, there's quite a few tendency also in at least governmental organizations to kind of feel comfortable with these regulations, because it's easier to say, okay, this is the rule, so I don't have to take a step to innovate and see how things connect and think about more inspirational and future-oriented concepts. It's easier to stick to, okay, these are the regulations, so I'm going to tell you yes or no. But if we really want to have the kind of radical changes that all these different challenges require, then I think we kind of have to step up the game. So I also believe that this has to do with stepping out of this almost following kind of role that I have perceived planning to have become. I would like to see a bit more guts and leadership from the domain of planning.
Yeah, so, but maybe even more radical, like position planning as something of a changing role instead of a restricting role.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would like to hand the word to Ellen van Buren. You're involved in a lot of changes on the ground, like as a researcher looking into them, but also as an advisor thinking with stakeholders to see how things can be done differently. What's your perception of the role of planners, of this like quality of looking ahead, but what we learned from Christian, also integrating certain elements together into a larger whole?
Yeah, it was interesting what you said, Christian. Also about the role of planning, and also what we could expect perhaps a bit more from planning. What I see is there's a sort of schizophrenia, perhaps you could even call it. If you see our policy ambitions with regards to these big themes, these major societal challenges, we've got the ambitions, we've got the targets, but somehow we don't succeed in realizing them. And especially if you look at the planning processes on the ground, then in those processes, these goals and ambitions, everybody is aware of them, but there are just too many reasons why they won't happen there, and they won't happen here, and they won't happen now. So that is something, and then there is the suggestion of the legacy, the sunk investments already done. So there's a lot of good and legitimate reasons why not to do it. But if you look at the time span we have, then we really need to start acting. And I think our planners should take more responsibility, because I think it is the role of planners in particular as a sort of warners for what might happen if we don't take action now. And we are making ourselves, well, we saw some in this video, we saw some of the sort of fright scenarios that might come towards us in the future. But if you think of, well, what will it cost to keep our cities in the future? It will make you think, well, are we making the right choices at the moment? And stopping planning processes, rethinking planning processes, that is something that is, even for planners, even though we know it, it is something that is very difficult and challenging to do because it's not appreciated by anyone.
So basically you say it's not only taking steps forward, taking steps in planning for change, but also planners are instrumental in warning society about dangers that are ahead that we need to cope with.
Yeah, and also from very practical reasons. If you look at how investments, for example, are being accounted for at the moment, and what time spans are being considered in order to make investments worthwhile. Well, you could argue, does it make sense to calculate with 50 or 80 years to make something affordable at the moment? If you see the big changes that are coming up, then you might want to reconsider your instruments and tools that you have for supporting those decisions. You need to reconsider them as well. And as long as we don't dive into the depth of these decision-making processes, then we don't really get a grip on why are things not changing.
Yeah. Planners by nature have a little bit of this, particularly in the Netherlands, perhaps, have a little bit of the quality that they would first like to analyze it, also particularly attached to the Delft way of thinking, analyzing and coming up with solutions, implementing them in certain strategies. But the reality of decision making and policy change is not one of big radical changes based on these kind of ideas, but rather of very small incremental steps. Are planners not really out of sync in that respect with how policy making and decision making works? Like, are we not starting from the wrong foot?
Yeah, perhaps we're too much in sync. So we have come to understand policymakers and all the other stakeholders too much, so we can empathize with them, why they do what they do. But the question is, if you don't change any of the incentive structures that we have, if you don't change the incentives, then you'll get the same outcomes as we have produced in the periods before.
Yeah, so you would opt for a more radical position of planners, but in that sense,
well, or at least open up the discussion of why it is what at the moment. In many cases, if we want to have changes, then you still get the sort of neoliberal inspired answer. We leave it up to the market to deliver, but the market delivers what is rational for them. So it is a bit naive to think that they will do something that will harm their interests.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see that actually from the market at the moment, there's quite a lot of, in the Netherlands at least, call for more coordinating, central coordinating in terms of planning, rather than a decade or two before. So I think that's also, you see, even in very market-driven sectors, you see that there's this call for coordination, actually.
Imagine that the market is calling on the government to step up.
Yeah, well, with good reasons, probably. So thank you, Ellen, for the moment. I would like to hear from Henk, perhaps a little bit of your experience outside of the Netherlands. It's good for you to reflect from outside of our bubble, particularly well, the very close-knit bubble, I would say, in the Netherlands that we have in terms of this this sort of planning circle. What are your views on the role of planning in the light of these monumental changes? Again, a big question, huh?
Yeah, very simple question, Paul. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see you and hear you. Critical, important debate, also in the context of the current time. We're leading up to an election, so post-election often a new cabinet, and not only a call from the market to step up, but Parliament actually agreed upon a motion that planning and housing should again be addressed institutionally better at the national scale. So there is a kind of dynamics. But then what? Because if we look at the challenges, nothing is new. We are very much aware, if we are critically listening and reading the report over the last decade and more, what these challenges are. Even a pandemic is not a new threat or challenge, only the way we handle these challenges actually shows our insecurity. If we go back 5 years, which is like always very helpful for me also in the international context, last month, 5 years ago, we agreed on 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And that you could say that is the ideal planning agenda for the world, because it addresses all issues of society: environmental, ecological, climate, governance, economic, social, and so forth, and so forth. And as a whole, that comprehensive agenda is far better used outside of the Netherlands than inside the Netherlands. So it's very interesting in my work, especially in Asia and Africa and Latin America, is that those Sustainable Development Goals are actually informing planning and policy practices much better than in the Netherlands. While we like to look at the world as being more siloed up and more fragmented than we are, because in the Netherlands there's this sense that a comprehensive approach is critically linked to our culture of dealing with our challenges. We don't link it to this comprehensive agenda that actually we agreed upon and put our autograph behind. So that is one. A second part of the challenges which are now exposed also in the context of the current pandemic crisis is vested interest. And Ellen already talked a little bit about it. Overcoming vested interests will be critically important to ensure that whatever we do now is not a response to our past positions or our past challenges, but actually something in preparedness for the future being uncertain or not. The question is how much is planning not only linked to policy and politics, but also to societal interest. And the stronger that tie is, the harder it is to overcome and to become activists or even radical. Then also planners fall into the trap of past practices, replicating the past in the context of a better future. Well, forget it. Really finding the opportunity to reinvent our practices based on our assessments and the collaboration with all partners is going to be critically important. And then there is I would say two more, I can say more, but two more things, sorry. One is the Netherlands is a very small place, and the interdependencies are not determined in the Netherlands and on this scale. So, and those are physical as well as economic, social, cultural, and environmental interdependencies. So if we continue to look at planning on the scale of the Netherlands, that planning will not succeed. So they're really looking across in the Delta, around the North Sea, in Europe, and in the European institutional context, as well as in a global context, is going to be critical important to perceive pathways forward. I think I stop here. Of course, perhaps something on the because I heard something on the inspiration side, so the design part of planning, because I think that is a critical, important, and also a critical core competence of the Dutch planning culture. And I think with design and planning, there are three aspects that come to mind for me that I find not only inspiring, but also a necessity. And one is that connecting planning and design, it is often more solution oriented. So while planning is not so much focused on interventions, planning and design together can help us focus on interventions that are catalytic, transformative, build sustainability, etc., etc. Because long-term or short-term, we have to act now. So interventions are critical and important, and planning can help provoke the right interventions. Second part is the capacity to connect. This comprehensive approach, of course, based on the SDGs and so forth, but there's a capacity not only to connect across these needs and scenarios, but also across interests and scales and cultures and so forth. So there's a far better capacity to connect than we like to provoke as planners. We keep it in our institutional self, but this capacity to connect is also cultural, and we can far better put this into practice in the process of planning, in engagement, in opening up, in creating these environments. And then the last, and then I stop, the last of the three is the political part, because there is aspiration and inspiration in planning. And we need aspiration and inspiration as a society, at all scales. Can be very small next to all these big, I mean, aspiration and inspiration should not always be about revolutions and change the world. No, they can be small, but those can be strohalmpjes. Sorry. Yeah. Things to hold on to. Because don't forget, we're paralyzed around the world in the context of these challenges. So of course we look back as a world, because there was certainty in the past. It is not easy if you see the poles collapse, or if you see a pandemic cutting across your society. So we should be helpful in this paralyzed world, and help not only provocative and activists, but also carefully and with empathy connect. Secretary General Guterres says this is a time of science and solidarity. And I think this is at the heart of planning, science and solidarity. I stop. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind of comprehensive overview. Interesting that actually with the, you name the SDGs as being very central and pivotal in the rest of the world, but not in the Netherlands. Do you have any idea why that is?
Yeah, well, that would be hard. One is we don't really care about the UN in the Netherlands, and the rest of the world does. So that's not helpful. Second, we think we are better than the world, while the rest of the world actually, sees the SDGs as something to hold on to, as something that is a foundation. And culturally, we don't link our policy to the policy of the UN, but better the other way around. So we actually think we informed the UN policy better than the other way around. Well, if we are really honest and if you just read the summary of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it is inspirational. And if we as planners can make that tactile and tangible for all scales of society, it's amazing. I remember Jan van Zanen when he was still mayor of Utrecht, but also chair of the Union of Municipalities, when we went to Quito for the Habitat 3 conference. He took pride in that the city of Utrecht presented the SDGs in their coalition agreement. But there are not many governments in the Netherlands that actually position the SDG in their, not on the national level, not on the provincial level, not on the local level. Last, if we look at the private sector, but also across society, there's a lot of cherry picking. So a business says, oh, I'll take care of SDG 2. And there goes fragmentation and siloing up, and then you get all these negative spillover effects of cherry picking. So it's the full agenda that actually helps us drive comprehensive, inclusive, and sustainable change, not the cherry picking agenda.
Yeah, well,
a very small addition. After Henk indeed said that we kind of have this tendency to look at ourselves and not so much at the United Nations. If we think about environmental quality, let's say the quality of our water, surface water, the quality of our air, we're amongst the worst, if not the worst of Europe. When we look at energy transition, we're bottom of the list in the entire European Union. So if we think about a couple of those really big challenges, we're not good at all. That doesn't mean that we haven't done a couple of really great things and that we don't have capacities, but I really think that Henk makes a point in us having a little bit of a tendency to kind of think, yeah, but we figured that out 20 or 30 years ago, so this is nothing new. Well, we might have to think again and also really look at others, because there's something to be learned.
Yeah, good. That is also pointing towards what Ellen previously said as a kind of putting things in perspective, the planners as being able to warn society. SDGs also in terms of providing goals, I think that is very interesting. And most times we're not, we don't agree about the goals at all. Also particularly in the Netherlands, and this could very well be such an opportunity to have some sort of agreement about goals which we would like to meet with. So indeed, I agree with Henk on using that much more centrally in our thinking. At the same time, overcoming vested interest, thinking not to and being careful not to think to replicate the past, but really radically doing something new. Role of design, all of these elements, it's quite a lot that we have to cope with. So on that point, and also looking at the time a little bit, I would like to move to Marloes van der Veen from Enexis, focusing on sustainability and changing systems, basically, and changing infrastructures from your perspective. I can imagine that you're much more down to the ground and really have trouble connecting with this discussion. How do you look at it?
Well, on the one hand, I do have some issues connecting with it. On the other hand, it's very relatable. I mean, in practice, if we really take the practice perspective here, I really relate to what Chris said earlier about planning being somewhat of a hurdle. I mean, if I look at it from an energy transition perspective, our like physical space cannot keep up with like the actual demand of what we would like to do right now. If you take, I don't know, solar parks for an example, all the planning procedures take so much time compared to the actual realization of a solar park. Yeah, it's crazy if you think about it, because if we look at the video we had earlier, yeah, the urge is huge to realize those parks, and planners appear to be a problem in that case. On the other hand, I do think we really need them, and that's because I think that mostly the market looks too much from their own perspective, which is mostly profit. I mean, I have to be honest about that too. Look at solar parks again, for example. Developers can put their solar parks pretty much anywhere. And that means that we as a grid company need to deliver a connection to the grid for them at pretty much any cost. While if you just change the location a little bit, the societal cost of that connection could be way, way lower. And that makes that the energy transition becomes expensive, which isn't needed, but that's, well, the logical result of the way we plan. And it also creates very long lead times because we need to make the connections on places where it, from a grid perspective, doesn't really make sense to make connections. So if you look from that perspective, you do need a planner to, well, I would say coordinate a bit in all those interests and make sure that the actual societal need is met there. And I was thinking, like, what would you need then to meet it? And I agree with what has been said before about needing some kind of gut or being like strong on the way you're going with sustainability. Because in one pilot we did, it's called Energie on Rijksgronden, so energy on governmental space, I guess. We met some planners that were actually very innovative, and they were making, well, they were pretty much bending all the rules. And that was a great pilot. Everything worked out, and, well, parks got realized in like a fraction of the time that is normally needed. But the only way it worked was because it was a pilot. All the planners felt like, oh, it's a pilot, we can, well, make it work. But as soon as you start talking about, okay, and now we have the conclusions, it worked fine, let's change regulations, well, the conversation stops, I guess. So
yeah. So, but basically, in that respect, I mean, talking about planners is maybe a bit of a too much a broad brush, because basically you say planners in sort of regulatory sense are sort of almost hopeless in terms of the work I'm doing, whereas planners who can coordinate and think ahead and put different kind of perspectives together with a certain outcome are actually very much needed. And you point to other interesting element, which says basically if it's a pilot in the Netherlands at least, then a lot is possible. We're able to bend the rules. We're able to have this kind of planning capacity that integrates and looks ahead and comes up with solutions that nobody thought of before. But replicating that kind of solution and lessons learned and putting them into practice elsewhere is then again impossible, and we're back to square one, where we have to fit in boxes that are actually stopping certain developments rather than progressing them.
yeah, and I'm also not completely sure whether you like should copy the things you did in a pilot in like new policy, because then the policy again becomes the hurdle. So I would, well,
continuous pilots.
Yeah, or maybe just more of a pilot mindset continuously by planners instead of like wanting to regulate everything.
Maybe it's good to hear of Christian Lamker based on these conclusions we're ending towards. What do you think about it?
Thank you. Yeah, basically, I agree with many things that have already been said. And personally, I'm also very optimistic about the potential of planners to change and of all of us to make that change happen. Though, let me add some more critical comments on what that means for the conditions and especially for ourselves. Because Ellen has started explaining a bit that it's also about responsibility. And it's quite easy to say, but what does it mean? Responsibility for me really means taking an action or a decision when the danger of failing is there or is even likely. And that's the tricky part. So how do we take this responsibility in these situations where we are really uncertain even about basic values, goals, which direction should we go, what holds all this together?
Yeah.
So that's the part where I feel that we need more responsibility, but also the way to use this responsibility to lead forward. So not only to warn, to protect the environment, but also to take that into a proactive direction. And in that sense, I think, or I'm sure as planners, we have wonderful tools, old tools, new tools, digital tools available to communicate, to organize, to bring all that together. What we sometimes miss is this ambitious long-term vision beyond the very broad agreement that yes, we want to be sustainable, but a bit below that. So what does it mean then for a bit more specifically, not just in one local pilot, but somewhere in the middle ground. So we somewhere need these roles in which planners take this responsibility, including the danger of maybe I'm wrong, maybe I fail, to use these broad ideas, ideals, international goals, and so on towards detailed actions at all scales. So not only local neighborhood pilots, but also at national, regional scales. So where it's a bit restarting again, but I think that's especially important given the large challenges that we have. And
do you mean that they're not there? Or that are not positioned well? I'm thinking about, for instance, the work done by Wageningen University at the beginning of the year, end of last year, where they sort of imagined what the Netherlands could look like in a bit further future.
I think that's exactly what I meant. We are really good at some of these imaginations that are broad, that are out there, and it's good for us to agree on that, but how do we take this responsibility to take it a step forward in all our individual actions? So I think in that sense, we still miss a bit of this piece. How can we get beyond this, having these visions, agree on them, but also make them captivating enough for all different planners taking this vision really up in their day-to-day actions, and not like the cherry picking from the SDGs, not like saying, okay, I'll do my work and that's SDG 2, but really internalizing that, having a captivating vision that somewhat changes mindset, changes actions across scales.
And you direct it towards the broad group of planners directly, or do you think it's actually rather more a bigger shared responsibility? Maybe political, but also broader shared societal responsibility.
It's definitely broader shared, and I would also say that planning definitely is a political activity where we debate, where we negotiate about the spatial dimension of society. So that is always there, and we cannot take that out of planning, in my understanding. But what helps us to be open about that. So planning is not outside of that, but planning is deeply within these political processes, including the possibility of failure, including also individual missions, ideas of individual planners. So some of them, we've heard about the good examples, experiments, they work. So there are planners who have something in mind. So at a very individual scale, it can work, but it seems that they don't get enough support from other parts of society, politics, than to take that a step forward beyond this pilot.
Yeah. Ellen said perhaps we're a little bit too much in sync with policy makers, maybe also politicians. How do you relate in that respect, Ellen, towards what Christian just said?
Yeah, well, in pilot projects, they're a lot more responsible because we can indeed bend the rules. We're allowed to bend the rules and be more bold and brave. But there should somehow, even at the start of a pilot project, it should be beyond the project that we need to think of. Huh? So what shall we do with the results? And what you see now is that pilot projects are often individual siloed projects, and there is no institutional embedding of what will happen with the results, what it will be the follow-up. In China, for example, it's an extreme example, but there they use piloting as a way to develop policies. So they try it in a region for 5 years. If it works, it will become national policy. And that is something which we seem not to dare to do, because a pilot is safe. You can fail safely there. And if it's a success, then everybody can claim the success. But who dares to take the responsibility beforehand that we will do something with the outcomes of it or with the learnings?
Marloes was also warning a little bit against that, that not to take that always as a too direct experiment towards policy relationship, and rather understand that we need to maybe at a lot of places bend the rules.
Yeah, but in a pilot you can see well what kind of new rules or reconfiguration of rules, what kind of what do we need, and from there you can start to change the rules, because rules are always about the past, because they're constructed, they emerge to regulate what we do. Or to guide our behavior.
Yeah.
But if we need to do something else, then we need different rules as well.
So there needs to be an active, very active relationship between the two, play maybe. Henk?
Yeah, because we do a lot of pilots around the world, also as the Netherlands, and they're actually an excuse to actually do something. So I'm not such a sometimes I even say I hate pilots, because it makes it possible to not do anything and not change. So we do pilot hopping around the world and not change and not commit and not change. So continuity, consistency and commitment as a contrary to pilots are as important. So the pilot only works if it has an impact on the institutional lock-in we organized. But that never or hardly happens. Yeah. So then the pilot just becomes an excuse, because it is short term, everybody can shine with it, and then we go back to normal. So if the pilot does not have this transformative capacity, both in real life as well as in policy, politics, institutional, and so forth, then the pilot is merely a doekje voor het bloeden. So yeah. I like it as a, in another way, as you could say, what is the background of your argument is you need, as the literature said, soft space. An environment where you have the opportunity to innovate, build trust, build enabling environment, build collaborations, participation. But that parallel soft space is not there to only pilot, but it's actually there to drive systemic change. And I think this is a difference between a pilot as a one-off and an excuse for the lock-in, and a pilot as a driver for that change where you can create that environment. So I don't say I disagree, but there are a lot of ingredients needed to make a pilot successful in the context of the change you want to see.
Yes.
I was also thinking, Paul, and I think it's a bridge to Jan and Marie, so in that sense it might be a good timing. I think in many ways in the past what you would often see is that many of the developments we would face would be developments where something would potentially get better. We would develop something new that everybody appreciated, or at least that was generally appreciated. But many challenges of today are challenges that come at costs. And how many of the different policy sectors are then immediately interested to participate in changing things and stick their neck out? I think the risk aversion tendency that is there, and to stick to your existing routines in organizations, is then a lot more attractive. So this kind of taking responsibility, what Christian referred to, this kind of guts, this kind of ability to actually go out there, not just in the safe environment of a pilot, but to try and see if you can, from that pilot, get to systemic change. I don't think there is initially a lot of willingness. What we probably need is something that relates to how can we make these big changes, whether it has to do with climate or agriculture or energy or circular economy. How can we make those challenges meaningful for a specific place? And if they become meaningful, if they start to carry potential and therefore become more attractive, that might be a way to actually get people to be part of that, open their eyes and think, hey, we could actually change things because there's something in there for us. That people from the domain of poverty know that changing the energy system might actually be good for preventing more poverty. That agriculture could really play an important role in climate adaptation, the creation of molecules for circularity, etc. I think that kind of meaningfulness it's stories, but it's probably also has to do with design. So I was really curious in the last part, how can we get those visions to become inspirational and meaningful for people?
Yeah, so, and I would like to add to that, it's not only in terms of quality, but also in terms of investments, perhaps, that you need to allow this to happen. Actually, you make it a little bit more difficult for me to come to Jan-Marie, because I actually thought that this positioning of the soft space that Henk just did is really the right moment to come to Jan-Marie, since she since she was in the jury of one of the most important soft spaces in the Netherlands, I would say, which is the EO Weijers Prize, who was just handed out last week. I think a soft space that creates so much change, which also sometimes, not always, but sometimes leads to real systemic change. It has led to systemic change in the Netherlands. So I would like Jan-Marie to ask you to help me also make maybe a little bit of bridge towards the next panel, which focuses much more on these kind of skills and instruments that we could perhaps also share with a wider audience than only in the group of so-called very special people who have this capacity of planning and maybe even more special design. So what do you think? Can you help me with this?
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, other speakers. Yeah, I think much of what has been said boils down to the division we often take in instrumental planning or operational planning and strategic planning. And we often treat that as two opposites. And I think there are two flip sides of the same coin. And that we should not divide it in either or, but do both. In the same institutions, it's not that the practice is doing instrumental planning and that the strategic boards are doing strategic planning. If we do not combine, we won't tackle the challenges we are confronted with. Because, well, instrumental planning is, well, changing physical reality, is taking action, is, well, has to work efficiently. But it's about changing the mindsets of people, and it's about not doing things better, but doing better things. And as long as we only try to do that in pilots and not take that lessons to the daily routines, they as Henk Oving said, they will stay pilots and won't become routines. And we really need new practices, new routines. Like Ellen van Buren said, if you don't change the incentives, well, then you will get what you always got. And that's the same with all kind of investments. We have so much lock-ins. So we really have to rethink and to reinvent all kind of practices. And that is a hell of a job, because they are practices we have been working on for a century. And then I come to a kind of urgency paradox that I see. That is, the less time you have available, the more important it is to slow down and to really invest in rethinking all these practices together. And I think that someone said we need a pilot mindset. And I really like that idea, that we have a pilot mindset, because that refers to a new way of approaching practice as a continuous pilot, but at the meantime, see this continuous pilot as the new standard. And then you combine this idea of doing better things instead of doing things better with a new practice. And I think we all know that we are living in a time with great uncertainties, and it's the climate and the pandemic and all that. And that can paralyze us. But I think we have to consider that doing things the same way we always did, or doing nothing at all, is much more risky than acting with a calculated risk. And I think that strategic planning will give us a kind of feeling for this calculated risk. And I think if we look, and that's the bridge maybe to the second part, it is very important that we invest in shared knowledge, in methods to do this, to foster this pilot mindset. It is all about capacity building and about networks between the practice and research, networks between government institutions and the practice. We have seen that going on for the last, well, 10 years more intensely, I think. In the Netherlands, we are quite good at that when it comes to water management. Think about the whole Delta program, where we really have built a body of knowledge between practice and research. But, well, we should do that in a more integrated way, taking into account all 70 SDGs and not just water management. So I think that this idea of organizing an ongoing process of piloting as the new institutional practice, that might be a good way to progress together.
And maybe adding to that, also allowing a large number of stakeholders in this process. So
sure.
Not to be sort of developing this kind of processes in splendid isolation. Also coming a little bit back to what Christian Lamker said about taking responsibility in that respect, not being limited to people who feel themselves to be planners. So that's a big challenge, I think, for which we all feel some sort of responsibility, otherwise we wouldn't be here. I also think it would be nice in the next session and afterwards in the discussion to also come up with good examples of this. Since we're making, at the end of the dialogues and what follows from that, the action that follows from that, we would like to make a new planning cookbook with a lot of examples and maybe recipes for that kind of change. And we're really interested in what we can all get together in terms of inspirational material to allow this to being shared. As always, much too much to be said and too little time to say it with too many people, but nevertheless, I would really like to thank all of you for joining in this first panel. There's now a short video again on a different food a little bit. I think that's interesting to see, both created by the University of Groningen, as an introduction to the next panel. So let's look at that. Thanks for this moment. A couple of minutes of introduction.
To deal with the impacts of climate change and the increasing flood risks in particular, new grand spatial visions and narratives will be required. And this makes a new appeal to the imaginative power of the planning discipline and its ability to connect a wide range of values, disciplines and stakeholders. Spatial planners, in my opinion, especially need to develop their boundary spanning capacities in order to be able to balance technical, communicative and adaptive rationalities. And that, in my opinion, is the challenge for the future.
That's an interesting perspective. In my view, for the upcoming decades, I think it's crucial that planners step outside of their office, outside their buildings, and get into the communities they're actually planning for. Talk to the local people. What are their dreams? What are their opinions? Which knowledge do they have? How can we together work towards a better future?
I feel that is very true. Yet at the same time, I also feel that planners should become more and more knowledge brokers. The solutions of tomorrow for the problems of today are, by definition, transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary in nature. We simply need multiple kinds of knowledge.
Absolutely. But given the complex nature of cities, we should also work towards responsive and adaptive cities. Responsiveness includes a kind of alertness and willingness to engage with new developments. And then adaptivity is about the capacity to actually deal with unforeseen circumstances. So that's the dialogue I would like to start: responsive and adaptive cities.
In my opinion, planners can fulfill 4 different roles to work with society instead of for society. First, a value-based role to explore people's sense of place and how they attach meaning to their environment. Second, a community-sensitive role to identify the tipping points where transformations might happen. Third, a mediating role, looking at the differences between actors and opinions. And of course, we shouldn't forget the 4th role, addressing stories, imagination, and creativity.
Okay, let's not be such cowards. In the end, planning is about making distributional choices. And for a just city, we need to choose. We need to choose affordable housing, social housing, over commercial real estate, and non-profit startup spaces over regular office spaces. As planners, we know how to envision a just city. But what we need to develop is tools to realize a just city.
Thanks. To add to that, I would say we need to be open explorers, to think what is possible, to be inspirational motivators for others, inspiring and exploring a sustainable transformation for society. And we need to find the courage to think beyond what's obvious and to explore these new ways together.
Yes, agreed. And then, based on top of all of this, at the end of the day, the planner is the one who lights the beacon, who sets an example, who gives us an image. If we sail in that direction, if this is the general idea of our actions, things will be fine. Problems will be solved, crises will be averted, and better places will emerge.
Well, that's quite a list, I would say. It's the whole department of spatial planning of University of Groningen. I think contributed to all of the roles that are seen as being very important to planners. Boundary spanning, starting from the community, being a knowledge broker. Being sure to be responsive and adaptive, etc., etc., etc. While at the same time also clearly choosing and showing a way ahead, lighting the lighthouse. That's quite a list, and maybe also a little bit I would like to discuss in the coming panel how these kind of skills could also be transferred to larger part of society, because basically that is also one of the starting points of this discussion, the question of how much is there to be developed as a sort of quality of a certain profession, and how much we can share, and in order in that respect, in sharing that, having a much broader and wider impact. So going into the skills and competences of planners, but with the idea of that being available for all. Is that a possibility? In order to help us come to conclusions in that respect, we again have a very well, very nice and well put together panel. First up, we have Professor in Urban and Regional and Environmental Planning at the University of Amsterdam, Maria Kaika. Welcome. It's so nice that you can join. Also, I think available at the moment, Erik Verhoen. He said he would be a little bit late, perhaps, but I guess he's already in the Zoom. He's principal advisor at Rijksuniversiteit, the agency responsible for roads, waterways, etc. at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. We also have from New York City a founding principal of One Architecture and Urbanism, with offices both in Amsterdam and now in New York City. He himself is now based in New York, so very nice that you can join in. Matthijs Bouw, known not only for his practice in terms of his work on planning and design, but also in education. Also, and I already mentioned her name, co-founder and manager of the Veld Academy in Rotterdam, Ruud Hopner. Well, you're also a little bit responsible for this debate, you could say, without probably knowing. You sparked an idea. And also mentioned in the same line, Annette Kempenaar, landscape architect and assistant professor at the Department of Planning at the University of Groningen. One of the people with whom we really started to develop this this edition of the new planning. And last but not least, Bart Raus. We already saw him in the small introduction video. He's assistant professor, spatial planning and research, researching adaptive planning and governance in urban and peri-urban transformations. Among others, it says, so probably there's a lot to be discussed, and very welcome to all of you. So I don't know if we can see all of you, would be nice. Please turn on your cameras if they're there, and then you can be in focus when you can say something. Well, maybe it's good to start. I see you in the top part of my screen. To start with Wart Raus, whom I introduced last. Well, you already made a big plea about what is very necessary for planners in the introduction video, saying basically we need to be much more adaptive towards change, since future is so uncertain. Being able to cope with this kind of change is a very important responsibility. How do you see that in relationship to a broader view of a changing society?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is indeed a very intriguing question for me. So what I took from the first panel is that there is this urgency to act. There are so many big challenges ahead. And what is key to all those challenges is that they are so much interconnected. They very much express high levels of interdependency, for instance, between human life and nature, or between sectoral systems, or between different places, right? And what I see in the field is that on the one hand, we seem to realize that we have to deal with this high level of interdependency by including more holistic understanding of what is the planning agenda, calling for circular cities, healthy cities, livable cities, all very holistic concepts. But on the other hand, I worry, do we take these interdependencies actually serious, right? Because they have an extreme high level of complexity. And that implies that one particular change in one part of the city or in one subsystem can actually lead to a cascade of effects. Think of how online shopping disrupted retail districts, and individual entrepreneurs and shop owners are adapting to that, right? Transforming their shops into coffee places to meet, to hang out, to do your work, and therefore actually contributing to a bigger transformation on what is the function of that street, no longer a shopping street, but the kind of public living room. So this kind of spontaneous processes are very much going on in the city and are shaping the trajectories of cities. They are hard to adapt, they are hard to predict, sorry, but they also make clear that cities have a kind of intrinsic capacity to adapt. And of course, the key question for me is how to balance that, right? Not all spontaneous developments are necessarily the kind of spontaneous developments that we want, but on the other hand, it would be rather naive to ignore them. So my call here is, not only to plan for establishing desired changes and aim to control the path to reaching that change, but actually also to support cities in their own capacity, their intrinsic capacity to deal with uncertainty. So this means, for instance, rules, regulations that allow for a bit of change within certain boundaries. It's a call for more flexibility in design, also building maybe more for temporality instead of indeed these long time periods. And I think what that means for the role of planners is, first of all, to make this complexity tangible. We have wonderful tools for doing that, and to also look how we can team up with indeed this more spontaneous processes, to make sense of what's going on. I think the Urban Future Studio, for instance, in the Netherlands is doing great work on that, also combined with art. And of course, to monitor and evaluate, right? We need time to reflect. So it should be compulsory in every project. There should be 10% of the budget should be reserved for doing that. It's often not happening. So how then to learn from this? So we need not only to prepare our cities for the future, but also to make our cities future-proof.
Yes. And in that respect, are you deviating a little bit from your colleague Christian, who basically said it's the role of the planner to integrate? Rather, you say it's better to take a step backwards and show this kind of complexity and allow for adaptation in relationship to this complexity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in some cases, of course, especially when it's about public facilities in which public planners have a high span of control. So then you can take the lead. But I think in many processes in which other societal actors have a prominent role, I think it's just simply an illusion to say, okay, we have this big urgent task ahead of us and we need to step up. That was a bit what I saw happening in the first panel. I'm quite skeptical about this. I think we should really cleverly think about how we can use the organizational capacity of cities in a more intelligent way, a more clever way. And I think many of the tools and the traditions that we have developed are actually oriented at prescribing the future of the city. Yeah. Instead of guiding and setting certain conditions. And this is by no way saying that I'm advocating for a kind of social Darwinism, right? Where only the richest can survive. Of course, there are key values to protect, but it's basically about how do we protect them? Do we protect them in a way that they are outdated, the kind of interventions that we do within a few years? Or do we try to formulate rules and to design buildings and neighborhoods that can protect those values, but allow for different configurations within them?
Yeah. And that requires quite a lot of skills and capacities, I imagine, and that are also well, maybe a little bit part of what we as planners need to do. I would like to ask Maria Kaika to reflect on that, and maybe picking up from this point of the types of skills that are needed to allow this to happen. It becomes almost imaginative what kind of 3D chess you would be able to need to do. Is it like that, or is it rather, and Mark also pointed a little bit towards that, in sort of laying and open this field in order to have a larger part of society playing a role in that kind of play? Maybe you can reflect on that a little.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it's a bit of both, but before I come to the, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Before I come to this conclusion, I want to reflect a bit on the recent significant changes in the social role of the planner. And I'll start with a quote. The quote goes, finally, I can practice planning and architecture for my own satisfaction and not to reform society. Guesses. Anyway, I don't have time to allow you to guess, but this comes from Philip Johnson, the once great advocate of architecture and planning as a social art. It comes in 1982, and it captures perfectly the moment of a paradigm shift in the role of the planner from a public visionary intellectual to an agnostic intellectual, a professional technocrat, artist, or craftsman. I mean, this shift did not come in a void. It came after decades of fierce criticism about the top-down ways in which planning, hand in hand with welfare state, produced spaces that were oppressive, monotonous, unobservant of ethnic, gender, and other differences. All correct. What did we do with response to this criticism? We changed. We turned to Jane Jacobs. We her call for a pluralistic bottom-up community planning. We changed our institutions, we broadened participation, developed a new planning paradigm committed to bottom-up processes. We proved that communities matter and we took them seriously. But Jacob's call did not find fertile ground in the 80s only because we received criticism. It found fertile ground in the 80s because it fitted so perfectly well within the shift to an aggressive neoliberal economy. And this may sound like a bit of a contradiction, but I'll explain what I mean. Because this new economy called not only for market freedom and withdrawal of the state, the new economy also invited for a big society to develop. This kind of somewhere in the ether that would develop a big society who would bypass oppressive top-down state and planning institutions, a big society that would sit down in the negotiated table directly with the markets and with developers, and they would find together innovative market-driven solutions for provision of pensions, of housing, of education, healthcare, urban development, you name it. The markets demanded a God's citizens to turn their welfare into a private affair, to turn the right to the city into the right to buying the city. So I think it's important to put this community planning paradigm into its proper socioeconomic context, because I want to make 2 points. First is that the shift to community planning gave us planners the perfect alibi to become promoters of the most aggressive neoliberal projects. While keeping our souls clean, we were declaring we were doing it all in the name of community empowerment. Community planning became the perfect alibi for developers to destroy historical sites, historical communities, to gentrify, to disenfranchise, you name it. And though it is true that modernist planning's top-down decisions that were piling up ethnic minorities into high-rise blocks had been violent acts. They were crimes against these communities. But our own acts performed in the name of community participation, I argue, have been equally violent. Is it not violent to throw community representatives unprepared, unarmed, unskilled into negotiating tables with preset agendas and then literally watch them being devoured by the superior knowledge, power, and expertise of developers and some planning consultants? Is it not violent to ask people who lack the time and resources to fence off aggressive urban development plans, or to make communities withdraw their resources to hire planning consultants to do what they cannot do? Is it not violent to treat unequals as equals? I think that's what we've been doing, and I'm being a bit provocative, but I think there is an element of truth in that. Mm-hmm. Now, what did we achieve by these consensus building exercises that treated unequals as equals? We achieved increases in income inequalities, in educational attainment, and of course, a sharp rise in environmental destruction. It's not what we wanted, but it's what we got. And what did we do? Because we didn't want that. We spent almost 30 years doing damage control. We turned planning into an immunological exercise. We vaccinated societies so that they can take even more distraction and inequality in the future. We promoted smarter technological solutions, smarter managerial solutions for communities to be more resilient to aggressive housing markets, etc. And we did well. There's nothing wrong with practicing planning as immunology or damage control. But today, more and more communities across the world actually refuse to be contented with damage control. They refuse to be immunized. They refuse to be called resilient. Communities in Louisiana who were praised for their resilience for years because they were hit by both Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil disaster, they launched a campaign saying, just stop calling me resilient, because the more resilient I become, it means that you can do more damage, more destruction to me. I don't want to be called resilient. I want to address the issues that made me need to become resilient in the first place. So what to do? I think it's very important, and I'm echoing almost everybody who spoke in front of me a bit before me, and I'm so happy you all did. We need to make planning a political act again, not a technical question. How? By stop treating planning as a consensus building exercise. Democracy has never been a consensus building exercise. From its conception, democracy has been a continuous agonistic process, a continuous debate and disagreement between equals, a political space where power does not have a fixed location or a person. So let us dare to practice democracy through planning again. How? By forgetting about, well, not forgetting about, but paying a bit less attention to consensus building exercises and pay more attention to dissensus practices. Focus on practices of dissent in communities and groups that do not wish to participate in consensus building panels, and instead they produce new methods and new radical imaginaries for social and environmental equality. I'm not talking about protest groups. There's nothing we can do with protest groups. I'm not talking about slacktivism. I'm talking about groups who formed communities by often sacrificing certainly their time, but even their personal lives to do that. Seek out these communities and try to institutionalize their practices. Concrete examples, the platform for mortgage affected people in Barcelona and across Spain. Yeah, this was at the back of 300,000 families being left homeless because they could not repay their mortgage debt. They got together, they formed a real community, not an imaginary or forced community, and they tried to institute change by declaring housing as the commons. They did all sorts of innovative things like occupying buildings belonging to the banks that evicted them, but most importantly, part of a branch of this movement gave, who was led by Ada Colau. Ada Colau, from that movement, became mayor of Barcelona. And she started, together with this group, instituting change. Another example, I don't know how long, but I can use other examples if I have time. Do I have more time?
Well, yeah, please. I like examples. So
yeah, I think we need some examples, if not anything, to inspire us that things can happen differently. Another example is the movement that came out of the efforts to privatize water in Greece, in Thessaloniki, the second biggest city of Greece. And what this movement did, they called themselves 136, and they tried to rethink water provision, not as a technical or managerial, not whether it should be private or public, but as a political question. So what they did, they got together with 100 municipalities, approximately, and their name refers to the amount of euros, 136 euros, it would take for each citizen to put in order to buy back this water company and make it commons if it came up for privatization. And the important thing about this movement is actually that they did it. They raised 1 billion euros as guarantee funds. They got support from across the world, including the former advisor to Margaret Thatcher's privatization programs. And they were up there bidding for Thessaloniki's water against global corporate giants like Suez Water and Mercorot. And why I single out this movement, why it's important, is because it turned the question of water from a false techno-managerial dilemma into a real political question. It posed a real political question not only to policymakers, but also to each citizen. It asked each citizen, if you had 136 euros, would you keep them in your pocket as buying capacity, consumer capacity, or would you turn it into real capital? What is real capital? It is the ability to make decisions over the use, management, and allocation of water resources in your own city. This is real politics. And they did it. So what I argue is we should retrain ourselves to fine-grained methods, ethnographic methods, not to become ethnographers, but simply to try to be there to engage with these communities and groups that do things differently, to capture their radical imaginaries and try to institutionalize them through pilots or not, and also to dare to retrain our, to reset our training agendas. We need to, in the universities, we need to train planners that will think for themselves, that will open their eyes to these alternatives and embrace the role of a public intellectual. And I heard a lot about the risk of failure. Do we really think these experimentations are risky? What we're doing, we are already in disaster. What can possibly be more risky than the situation we are today in? I think the risk we take by continuing to invest in failed methods of the past again and again and again is much higher than the risk to experiment with all this. And yes, okay, we may fail again, but the point is to try and fail better next time. That's what planning has been doing. That's why we have been in the forward of visionary change. Let's try and fail better. Let's dare to do that. And I'll stop.
So thank you very much for that contribution. Also, I would like to ask you, but of course it's impossible to answer. But whether we're at a sort of pivotal moment again, when we look back 20 years from now at this moment in our society, perhaps that we could be looking at that kind of coming together of a change in society and a taking up of a different kind of role. So I'm hopeful for that, at least. It's very interesting what you put to the table, and also what you mentioned of this pivotal moment. I think it's interesting to take a look again at this document of Rem Koolhaas that I mentioned in the beginning of whatever happened to urbanism, where actually he's reflecting in very similar ways on what we have been doing in that sense as urbanists.
Can I just try to answer very briefly your question?
Yes.
I think we are in a very significant moment of change. We should take our role seriously and change it. And what indicates clearly that we're in a moment of change is what was mentioned in the beginning, that markets now demand from states to step in and regulate.
Yeah.
Why? Yeah. Because because they see that communities don't buy the participatory game anymore. There is continuous dissent, and the recipe doesn't work anymore. And I think this is really significant. We have to capture this moment.
Yeah, but we have to be sort of aware of what kind of play we're in a way.
Yeah.
I think also interesting what you mentioned is the importance of also in the examples you name of the commons, and it's interesting to see that actually in the AOR's prijsvraag, the competition that was handed out last week, almost in which was about agricultural transition in parts of the Netherlands, that in almost all of the contributions, this idea of the commons as really connected to certain resources. This is so important. The commons is not an idea, it's really a resource of a community, that this was very central in
the method
contributions.
And the method of managing.
Yeah. So perhaps that's interesting to pick up on these things as well. I would like to, of course, we're running out of time tremendously, like very often, but that in my feeling, it doesn't matter too much, because I think it's interesting to introduce Matthijs Bouw to this conversation at this moment, particularly since you made this interesting shift from being very much ingrained in the debate in the Netherlands and taking a little bit the chance and maybe opportunity, I don't know, maybe you can say something about that, of the Rebuild by Design competition that Henk put into place, and moving to the United States and having a completely different view on how planning is perceived and also how it's being made operational. So perhaps you can say something about that.
Yeah, and after all this brilliance, I have to sort of put a disclaimer in. I'm a field architect, And so my contributions are going to be mostly anecdotal, although I did have some history indeed, as you say, Paul, in Dutch planning, and thank you for inviting me. And that history was at that time triggered by the fact that we saw all kinds of new actors in the mid-90s in Dutch planning. So it was for us really interesting to work with Schiphol Airport on the islands of the coast. It was really interesting to work with Siemens and these banks and these big construction companies to think about the maglev train, and to really see that in the Netherlands at that time, maybe under a neoliberal paradigm, different actors started to play a role. There was also a sort of, I would say, and I'm not sure if it's called an increase in democracy, but at least many more voices that were at the table. And in the planning projects that we tried to do in the Netherlands, like the Vereniging Deltametropool from the early 2000s to the Randstad 2040 to the Olympic main infrastructure, we were really always thinking like, how can you sort of diversify the conversation about the future of the country and about the sort of role of planning. And it was maybe because of that sort of knowledge, and many of that sort of developed in conversations with Henk, that when being part of the Real by Design competition, we really were able to use the sort of skills as designers for convening around big issues, bringing diverse groups of people to the table. That led to a sort of plan for the coastal protection of Manhattan that was more diverse than a typical infrastructure project, that had multiple functions, and that was really developed together with many more actors than just government. And we have been working after winning that competition, then you have to start working towards implementation. And what we really try to do and focus our company on is sort of what does it mean to use these projects and implement them to as a way to also create the necessary cultural change, or to build the muscle that is necessary within the sort of institutions and systems that you work with to do these type of projects, and then to also translate that back to the sort of bigger and strategic skills. On the one hand, we're doing all these projects along the coastline of Manhattan and other cities, but we're also working again on the strategic plans of the city of New York to deal with climate, which has a sort of much longer role. And I'm really sort of intrigued there with what was said earlier about this sort of relationship between the operational and the strategic in planning, and the sort of role that designers can play in bringing these things together. And I see that designers are not doing that. And I see that specifically they're not doing that in the Netherlands. We have this sort of idea that designers, because they have the ability to communicate and to integrate and to innovate, can have a sort of real space in planning. But in the Netherlands, what you see is that the designers love to think about the very long term, about the sort of the plan B of the Netherlands, or create sort of visions on the circular economy or healthy cities or whatever. But those are pretty far off in the future. They're relatively sort of isolated. And then there's sort of the operational designers who deal with the here and now, and who have a scope that is much closer. And that problem became very clear to me as we recently did our first big sort of climate projects in the Netherlands for the metropolitan region of Amsterdam, where we were asked to sort of explore how investments decisions now and in the future could include, in area development, could include climate adaptation. And working back in the Netherlands, it scared the living shit out of me. And I'll tell you why. And apart from the fact that, of course, 95% of the planning that happens in the Netherlands is done fantastic and it's brilliant and world-class, etc. What I saw is this real gap between maybe some long-term thinking and the operational. I saw the fact that, for instance, in the fact that on the ground, the norms and codes with which we work in climate are relatively near term. And there is no real thinking of what would happen beyond 2050. There is and that part of that has to do with the fact that that period of uncertainty is too difficult. And part of that has to do with the fact that the people who have been developing and arguing for these codes have a sort of history in water management, and that is a history in which climate was relatively stable. And there has been very little realization about the fact that we are coming to a period that is not only unpredictable, but that will have accelerated change. And there has been very little, very little understanding of what that might mean. What I also saw is that climate in the Netherlands is often even equated with water. So a whole host of issues relating to climate, heat, but even further down, equity and these type of things are also not really addressed. So what I encountered was a sort of professionalism without really a deep engagement with the complexity of these problems. And I found that really interesting. I also found that maybe that has to do with the fact that the designers that are in this space are still working from a control perspective, and that's really something that we need to change, and very much from a spatial perspective. Whereas, and I really agree with Maria in that sense, that the real solutions to the big challenges of our time might not be primarily spatial at all. It is rethinking our political economy. It is rethinking what it means if we change our political economy to how we deal with financial arrangements and contracts and our regulations. And I really feel that like working internationally, I learned a lot of other tools, and it was only that I would be invited back in the Netherlands under the disguise as I was still a Dutch person. So the Dutch are the only country in the world that doesn't take advice from people outside of the country, but I was still enough of a Dutch person to be inserted there. But I really felt that the whole planning system was incredibly or too inward looking, given the sophistication that the country has, the capacity that it has, and the way it likes to show itself internationally. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, you've said a lot, though I do have a question. But the Dutch are also known, I think, and like to chastise themselves a little bit, so that you didn't lose yet, as long as it doesn't hurt too much, of course. Is planning in that respect more political in the United States? Can you say that?
Yes, and that has to do with the fact that like America is an extremely cruel country, and so everything becomes political, because if you don't organize yourself politically, you'll be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's really scary at a certain level. I really hate the fact the way projects are done here in the United States are not based on a good planning process, but only partly based on a good planning process, but really are political deals.
Yeah.
But it also really creates with that the motivation to be much more outward looking and much more aware of the different tools that you can develop in order to achieve outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. So basically looking back, so that's not necessarily positive, of course. I mean, this kind of consensus building has a certain quality in the Netherlands, but what you described is a certain professionalism which was created, which first doesn't look at the real consequences and doesn't want to oversee anything outside of the norms and codes that have been envisioned before. And second, not a professionalism which doesn't take real responsibility, which comes back to a point which was made earlier.
Our consensus culture has at this moment huge difficulties with challenging the neoliberal model in which we still work. And our consensus culture needs to start challenging that neoliberal model if we want to create the change that is necessary given the stuff that is coming at us.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot being said in such a short period of time, and also deviating quite a lot from where we want to end up with. Still, I would like to to go in that direction a little bit. But first, and maybe Erik, you would be up to the job to bridge that gap. I would like to ask Erik Verhoen to reflect on that, because I think I can imagine as a little bit of an insider at Rijkswaterstaat, you can feel a little bit of what Matthijs is talking about. Of course, you've been outside of the government as well and looking into it. Nevertheless, I'm curious what you think of this turn the discussion took, and whether we can, well, maybe take a step down from too much of a societal, critical societal point of view, which I think is very important, but also think of how we could end up with reflecting on certain skills and capacities that could be useful for a much wider audience to think about coping with these future challenges. Erik.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And thank you for having me in such a prominent discussion. Yeah, I would like to share some views from inside, just how I'm looking at the daily practice of both strategic and operational planning as we deal within the Ministry of Transport and Water Protection. I think Rijkswaterstaat, which is basically the road authority and the water authority in the Netherlands, is part of the ministry. It's also on the direct political responsibility of the minister. And that's also why we are in a complex situation, of course, in this kind of transition discussions and the space we have for choosing our role in it. But I'd like to share some ideas just to help to bridge some of the gaps already pointed out. There's not to pick up on already said. What I see from the inside is that of course the planning discipline is from origin an integrating discipline. I'm brought up with the thinking about facet and sector planning, and we always thought that in space we kind of are looking for a balance of different interests and make it into coherent planning and so on and so on. And what I see is that we are still talking about integrated planning, but in fact we are in a world of multi-sectoral planning. And multi-sectoral planning is much more about the battle for space. In fact, if we are honest with each other, in the Netherlands, we are facing a battle of space on all levels. It's also very illustrative how you see the discussion about the possibly new ministry, reinventing the old Ministry of Housing and Planning into a new form. And the name I heard lately was the Ministry of Physical Environment and Building. Never there was the mentioning of planning or ruimtelijke ordening or whatever you call it. So don't think that we reinvent the old from just like that. In fact, I see that we are living in a kind of a VUCA world, which is a volatile world, which is an uncertain world, which is a complex world, which is an ambitious world. And that, in fact, we are more in this multi-sectoral battle for space at the moment than in working together in all kinds of sustainable concepts we like to achieve. So the question here is who is connecting the dots, and what is the role of spatial planning in connecting these dots, and who is taking care of the perspective of the users of space and the citizens living in their environment. And I think that's the world we have to focus on with our planning paradigms. How can we help this world? And what is the role we can pick in this world? And I think we have to realize we are working in a new arena. It's not only not falling back into old planning concept, but also don't think we can fall back into traditional planning instruments and procedures and all the kind of things, because planning in the Netherlands was also very much procedural, instrumental, regulated by law, and so on and so on. This world is all changing, and we have to be very aware of the kind of arena we have to play a role in. And perhaps new planners are more builders of alliances, builders of arrangements among stakeholders, than chosen or be granted a more integrated role. And if you look at the needs which come from this kind of new arena thinking, I think I very much agree with the things said by Matthijs, for instance, that there's a very large gap between the more strategic thinking on the one hand, and operational planning on the other hand, and we really need to bridge that gap. We really need to have new planning concepts which are guiding and which are much more deeply analyzed and really help us to bridge the visions and ambitions we have on the one hand, and the daily practice on the other hand, how to implement and realize this kind of new goals we try to achieve. I see it very much, for instance, in the transportation sector, which of course is one of our main focuses at Rijksuniversiteit. We all talk about multimodality, we all talk about sustainable transport, but we hardly have any guiding concepts as yet on how to build on that, how to realize that in the spatial context. So I'm very much pleading on this new concepts who are really guiding, who are much better analyzed, and who are also practically able to be practically implemented. And we have to deal with new values, which you already mentioned, like the SDG goals and so on. I already introduced the kind of thinking about the donut approach, which Kate Raworth for economics introduced, in which you say, well, we have boundaries in our spatial system in which we can organize the livability and accessibility of our urban areas and all the levels of scale. And the boundaries on the one hand are, of course, the boundaries of the planet and the way we deal with climate change, circularity issues, and so on. But there's another boundary, which is the equity issues. There was a study of the Raad voor Infrastructuur en Leefomgeving, of Leefomgeving and Infrastructure, about the affordability of cities. That cities at the moment in the Netherlands are pushing out the not so wealthy part of the inhabitants, which is already taking place in, for instance, the United States for decades. You can see pictures of the welfare distribution between central urban areas and other areas, which is quite striking. And this is happening in the Netherlands also. So it's not only the environmental boundaries, but also the social boundaries of the system, which very much determine the field we have to operate in. What I also think is that we have to be much more practical about the business case part of planning. How can we pay it? How is it feasible in practice? Steps are not well thought through in the public and private business case part. Who's paying? Who's benefiting? That kind of issues should be addressed more in more detail, and has also to do, of course, with the discussions we had before about the benefits and the risks, how they are taken care of. I also think we are looking very much at new forms of participation and adaptive planning approaches, which we should be also become more concrete on how to organize that. We see the need for new forms of participations to bring in the insights of all kind of stakeholders. And in fact, we have to work on a kind of organic planning concepts in which we very much have a double goal in setting our long-term goals and mobilize people along their own long-term goals, and on the same hand take very practical steps toward it. And it's not a straight line, it's a very organic process in which planners have to pick their role as well. So right now, I think we on the conceptual level, I very much recognize the ideas already shared in this panel, but I really am looking to the step to bridge the gap towards operational and useful concepts for planning and roles of planning, which can really help us forward, because we are lacking them right now.
So basically, in your analysis and your view on things, actually, the planning as a profession needs to quite radically change. It needs to do much more and much better. That is quite striking. You agree to the point that Matthijs is making, looking outwards in, which is also sort of quite fundamental and challenging as planners in the Netherlands. While at the same time there's a certain risk to it. You also said as planners as a role of bringing together all of these elements. Quite easily we could fall in the trap that Maria sort of outlined, and not position this as a very central political debate where we should take the responsibility in showing that kind of reality. It's also, I'm quite struck by the fact that actually more and more of you in the panel are speaking in terms of using words of battle, violence. There's a battle for space, so it becomes quite vivid actually that this is a quite critical issue we're dealing with. So there's quite a lot to be done if I hear all of this. Still, and I think it's only fair to go towards the last two speakers of the panel in this respect, because basically what of course it's always a little bit difficult of what you hear yourself someone else talking about or is really what they meant. I think it was very important for me at least, a position Ruth Hopner took at the third edition of the New Planning Dialogues late last year, when we were still allowed to all come together in the big building of actually the rebuilt building of OMA, the old From building in The Hague, where we were all in this one big monumental room. And at that moment it was raised this idea that actually planning capacities, for which we could after this debate be very critical, should be made available to much larger portions of the society in order to cope with these large challenges. That's at least what I heard from Ruth. So perhaps you can correct me in this, or see how you look at this kind of question of planning capacities and skills that are available to larger parts of society. Ruth, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Sorry, my son just came in screaming, so I was a little bit distracted.
All happen at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's funny that we always talk about planners as architect of researchers, because I'm working also for the municipality of Rotterdam, or I work for the municipality. I see a lot of planners who are not planners. Like in unintended planning, I see a lot. So I think that could be a role of the future planner to teach the unintended planner about the consequences of planning. Because we have the problem at the municipality that people keep waiting on each other, that issues are very complex, and like we know what to do basically, but nobody knows how to do it, and we has to do what first. And then often like the room you get to plan, or is often defined by a lot of people who are not involved in the planning process, by procedures, by regulation or something they have to do first, and other people have to wait, or they made not their aims clear to the planners. So yeah, we thought it would be very helpful to have a process of mutual planning. And we developed a course for all our, for all people in the municipality of Rotterdam to follow planning training, in the sense that we say, I'm working for the social department, but I have a planning background. So we said we place the social issue, or the social problem we want to place central, and we invite everybody to involve a planning process, but we also teach planning skills. So we make clear what kind of consequences their planning intentions could have in terms of urban quality or sustainability. And we try to arrange groups where in every group is a real planner, and for non-real planners, like unintended planners, like people working for the health department or for the social department, people dealing with unemployment, this kind of stuff. So we try to evoke like an interdisciplinary planning process in teams. And we did that the first round last year in a training, and we see that it's working very well. People are very happy to work with each other. And I recognize a lot of aggressive language we talked about right now, that people talking about spatial claims. We have that at the municipality as well, especially with the densification strategies in the inner city center, that we are not talking about opportunities anymore, but about I claim this space for my facility, and I claim this space for my transportation needs. So we are not thinking about anymore about the product or the vision we want to create, the city we want to create. We just talk about our own piece of cake we want to have in this planning process. And we have seen in the course in the training that when we give people the chance to talk about win-win situations, about what can I do for you, what can we do for me, and what can we reach, what can we achieve together, that it really helps to define an integrated strategy, that they realize what other people need and how can they respond to these needs. So we had very positive feedbacks, and now we are entering the second round. And I think initially we really want to train. We started with 20 people working for the municipality now, and we are now training the next round. But we are already talking about scaling up, like really having everybody trained, more or less.
If you hear the debate till now, you can also be quite critical of these skills that you might be training to the non-planners. Like, should we not be looking much more, first of all, into ourselves? Is it not much more, also in terms of the aggressiveness of this language, that perhaps what's really at play is a rethinking of this kind of making operational this kind of planning skills and qualities. Are you not teaching the wrong things? I'm wondering. having heard this discussion till now?
No, I don't think so. We don't use traditional planning tools. We look very much, we decide in the course, we follow the research by design process, but we spent a lot of energy in analyzing the problems together. But for example, we use for idea forming, we use the Just City Index developed by the Just City Lab in Harvard, which is a tool which is far more broader, like talks more to people with a non-planning background. So we don't really use classical tools. We try to use tools which are like more stimulating in a broader way, value-wise, that you discover other different values than just spatial values.
In that respect, already you could feedback that kind of learnings into the discussion of the planning discipline as such, and the kind of feedback in this kind of communication with the non-planners that take part in this kind of course.
I can see that they can inspire each other, and it's also, I think it's very important what kind of assignment you give to the group. If it's a non-spatial assignment, but they have to develop a spatial strategy to tackle the problem, they come with a lot of different solutions than only spatial solutions. Do I answer the questions? I am not sure if I understood you in the right way.
No, it would be nice to see these kind of solutions. I'm really curious in what kind of things come out of this kind of the discussion. So I'm curious of what you're achieving at the moment, and I'm also curious that this is actually sort of scaling up is going on at the moment. So probably there's some sort of demand for that kind of way of thinking and working. We have to move on a little bit because we're running out of time tremendously, and I think also it would be very nice to have a short break pretty soon, or at least I would like to have that. But perhaps Annette, you could help me a little bit in wrapping up this part of the debate we're having.
Yeah, sure I can, but I'm still a bit dazzled by all the different food for thought that has passed by the speakers, and also I'm not sure where to start. I think what we see, there is an urge for planning, but I think there's also an urge for diversity in planning for planners, different roles of planners. And I'm not so worried about other professionals who are into the battle of space, getting a hold of the good skills to be able to take part in such a conversation on how this space or the spaces are going to be used. I was more stricken by the contribution of Maria on those communities who are in an unequal position to take part in those kind of battles or discussions or conversations or dialogues. And that brought something that I heard of to the front of my mind, that there is in the UK, for example, an NGO who provides planning assistance to communities. And I think maybe something like that we could do also in the Netherlands, because I think we're very professionalized if you look at planning debates, and that would help communities to also have a good position in this debate and have assistance in promoting their ideas and also bringing in their interests.
I'm curious how Maria looks to that example, because I can imagine that can also be exactly what you meant while describing the sort of participatory kind of planning thinking that has been in vain for quite a number of years, where there's actually this kind of such a big power disbalance that it's actually not really this kind of contribution. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I don't want to interrupt Annette
interesting conversation, but okay, just briefly, yes, I fully agree with Annette that indeed, if we want to bring in a difference and different communities who have new radical imaginaries, we have to give them not to train them, we need to give them support. We cannot expect from people to allocate time to learn everything. This is not a pastime activity for them. If we want them to do it, we need to support them also financially. We either change the growth model and the political economy, which we can't do, or if we operate within a neoliberal economy, let's be fully neoliberal about it. Let's pay them for the time and effort they put in. And I think Annette's suggestion is fantastic. Yeah, and don't let it down to NGOs. We planners, planning institutions can do that.
Yeah.
I let it up to NGOs or private.
Yeah, we as academics can also spend some of our time on assisting those kind of groups, and that also brings me to what Wart was bringing to the table. That I think one of the things is that a lot of things are already happening, and people are self-organizing, and things are changing maybe in a way that we're not expecting. And I think as planners, but also as designers, it could be very helpful to ride on those waves that are already there also. And we have to sort of have develop a sort of capacity to see what's happening and use that, and also interweave our own activities with those developments that are going on in this complex world, because we are just not able to overview the future, because there's so much uncertainty, so much unknowns, that we have to sort of develop this capacity to deal with that in various positions, I think. But I'm just sort of reflecting of what I've picked up so far on the discussion. I think it was very rich, and there's I hope that it's taped so I can watch it again, get all the gritty details out of it.
Well, indeed, I think it will be very worthwhile, and we will. So it has been taped, as Alain-Griete already said, and I'm also truly very happy with this conversation we're having.
But to reflect on something else, you mentioned that we had these discussions beforehand, and I'm actually quite happy that it turned out to be a little bit different than we anticipated. It's so much richer now. For me, at least.
Well, I think the positions that are taken are quite strong, and also there's quite an agenda to be taken up to. So the new planning is not for nothing, I would say. It really requires quite fundamental rethinking. I think in this debate it became most clear up to now. So actually, looking back into the previous editions, it's actually much more rigorous, what we discussed. I'm sorry to have to cut it short, because I'm actually I didn't, so I should have maybe, because then we would have ended this conversation 45 minutes ago. I think what we should do is take a short break. I will get into contact with Alain-Griete. Maybe Alain-Griete can come into view, and we discuss how to wrap up the afternoon. But I think perhaps Alain-Griete, are you there? Yes. It's good to just put in a short break.
Yes. So I think we can go for a 10 to 8 minutes maybe, and we come back and we reduce on the time of breakout room. But I think because there are so many examples coming in the chat box, we haven't yet actually discussed the questions that are coming in. So it's good to take those questions in the breakout rooms. So let's come back
But perhaps we can just come together and see what points to pick up on coming from the chat box, because indeed it's a quite lively discussion, and it's a pity if we don't do that. So let's take a couple of minutes of break and see if we need to go into the breakout rooms or whether we can pick it up immediately.
Okay, sure. Let's let's do that. Yeah. Okay, see you all in 5-7 minutes. Bye. I would request everybody, whoever is back from the coffee break, to switch on their videos for this last session. Okay, I hope everybody is back from the break. We are already running out of time, so let's change the plan a little bit. I can see already people leaving because they had some other commitments at 4, and we are really, really late with our time. So I had a small talk with Paul, and I think it is better that rather than dividing ourselves into different breakout rooms, we have the discussion of the breakout room and also take up the questions from the chat box as a group, as a whole group. So now, because people have already started leaving, we are not a huge group. So I think we can manage all together. I would just request everybody to switch on your video for the whole time, this session. We really want this session to be more interactive. My Malvika is putting in the chat box the link to Miro board. We want to try this new interactive board, whiteboard setup to see how effectively we can do this digital method of events. So I'm going to share quickly. So I hope if all of you have the link in the chat box now, and you have to log in with your own either Gmail address or office address. Just quickly log in there. We will, as soon as you log in, you will be able to see our board. So in the board, there are 2 questions that we are asking. What are the examples that we have been discussing in today's discussion are relevant to think about it further or to discuss it further or to something there to learn from? And the second part is which skills and capacities are we lacking? So what kind of skills do we need? You only have to drag and drop these sticky notes towards the left side and put it up in these 2 pink and blue boxes. That's the interactive space for you. So I will hand it over to Paul to have this discussion on the Miro board, and we will keep sharing our screen in between. But it would be nice to have everybody on video so that we can see. Please raise your hand in case you want to say something. We will pick up your question then. Paul.
Well, I think I already see a lot of hands immediately, so that's good. No, but I think we really have a couple of minutes left only. So I think it would be really useful if we can leave open the Miro board to collect your ideas, because for us it's important in compiling the new planning cookbook that we're working on, which is still a huge effort. We're not even close to starting, but I do think it's important to collect concrete examples of what we just discussed about. I think it makes matters much more clear, and also it can be very inspirational. I think that was mentioned time and again as being very important to this discussion. So I have a couple of minutes for some reflections, maybe perhaps from someone who was not in the panel. There is a lively debate on the chat, so we will pick up on that later. But I'm just curious from just seeing the people on the screen who would like to react and put forward a very important message that has not been mentioned yet. Can that be the case? Let's see. Who's wanting to say something? Otherwise, I'm going back to the panel again, because I saw Maria actually. Hans Dekker, do you want to contribute something? Please unmute if you want to say something. Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Hans Dekker. I used to be a landscape architect. I'm trying to contribute a different way, dealing much with society and space instead of space and society, what I formerly did. But what strikes me is that I think we should incorporate what I call the spiritual realm. Because what I see is that we are dealing with problems that have to do with who we are as a person, as people. And it seems to be, for me, that it is what we see now is a result of the past. And we have to deal with the future. Don't you hear me? You can't hear me?
We can.
So I think what we need is a sort of dialogue in a triangle between society, space, and the spiritual realm. And that is what is completely missing now, also in this conversation. And it seems that we are more or less tangled in circles, and we are dealing with abstract conversations, but we are not dealing with the real issue of selfishness, self-centeredness, which has to do with all these problems that we are facing now. Nobody is responsible for this world. And if nobody is responsible for this world, who can change it? So what we are doing, we are trying to solve the results of all these problems. And that is an endless way of dealing with these problems. And as designers and planners, we should go to the origins of the problems. What is really going on here? And this is the things that we should put into our debate.
Well, I think interesting position you take. I do think we hinted towards, at least in terms of the necessity of a much more value-based discussion. We hinted towards this.
Yes.
Perhaps it needs a little bit more attention. I just looked at the Miro board and I'm quite excited about what's happening there. So there's quite a lot of examples coming in and points being raised there. So I think that's really very helpful to us. It's actually so much that it's difficult for me to pick up on elements that are put there. Alankrita, do you want to add something?
Yeah. I think we can take a look at this Miro board after maybe 5 more minutes. Let's see if anybody else have any questions, and we pick up at the board after, reflect on the board after 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah,
because
well,
let them feel it all. Everybody is feeling something or the other.
Yeah, so I think that's very helpful, and it could continue a little bit also after we close the discussion.
Yes.
Maria, I saw you raise your hand a couple of times, so please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just really keen to hear from Ruth Hauptner some more because she seems to be working hands-on, and I would love to hear some examples of what kind of spaces people you work with claim, what kind of skills you train them with, and more importantly, what kind of city do you think is produced by these multifaceted, very localized or personalized, individualized interventions?
Yeah, Well, you were already asking that also in the chat. So indeed, it's good to hear from you, Ruth, to how, if you have concrete examples.
Concrete examples of planning tools, or what do you mean?
You said that people claim spaces, for example.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you provide them with the skills to know how to do that. If I understood correctly, can you just give us an example of one person without naming them, of course, and one space and what
yes.
you did, and reflect perhaps a bit on what that does to the city as a whole. What kind of cities do we produce by these acupuncture points?
Yes, maybe he'll actual very actual discussion at the city right now in Rotterdam. I'm coming from Rotterdam. Is the division of public facilities in the city center. We have not there's not enough space for public facilities. At the same time, the whole debate about public facilities. What is a public facility? Does it has to be public, or can it also be done by citizens offering a public service like the commons? So this is somehow opened up the discussion about it. Meanwhile, it is within the city still a claim debate, because we have the department of schooling department, the department of sports, and they all claim their own piece of land for their own facility. And it's very difficult through regulation to combine all these facilities, and money-wise, it's also very difficult to give money to the private partners or to citizens to run a public facility because it's public. So in the course also we discuss the possibilities of doing it nevertheless, or to address private financiers or finance to address to build a public facilities in a mutual way with private and public partners, and the way how it can be done and how it can be multifunctional. So this is an example of talking about claims, land claims, and discussing it with also with citizens and also with people from the municipality.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It will be good also if you, maybe we can get into a direct conversation about that, about these very concrete examples and outcomes of this trajectory. I think we have to cut the discussion short here. I would like to give the word back to Alain-Griete, and maybe you can pick up on the one or two things that you saw in Miro that I couldn't immediately digest.
Yes. Paul, before I do the Miro board, maybe I'll ask once Ward to, I think he also had to leave, have to leave soon. There are other speakers also leaving soon. So maybe if he want to say something at the end, because we were supposed to have these breakout rooms, so he might have something to say at the end. Ward, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, very fascinating. I think what I think would be nice to pick up on in drafting this book is that there are some central tensions that became clear by exploring these different roles, but also different responsibilities for planning. And of course, one is between freedom and equality. Another one is between more short-term, organically versus strategic and long-term. So that was, and I guess there are more, and that's a bit how I looked at the overall discussion. And to conclude with, I think it's really nice that you brought us together, that you created this opportunity. And while I was not too much looking ahead to be behind the screen for 3 hours after already a long day, I was completely fascinated. So I'm also very grateful for the moderation and the other speakers. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ward. It was nice having you. It's always the thing that we have to cut short things. It's always, we are delayed. Everybody wants to say something and we don't want to avoid those discussions. So it's nice that we could have it. I understand that it's a Friday afternoon, so it must be already a long week. But yes, I agree with you that it has been very interesting.
Thanks.
Throughout. Yes,
Okay.
thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yes. And maybe let's, looking at the Miro board, I'm really glad that everybody is very enthusiastically using. So some of the names coming up is, if I see it properly, so we have maybe all of us has received the booklet. So some of the names are from there. For example, water as leverage was discussed there. We have discussed as planner as a boundary spanner in the Verdas project. So it's also good to look back at the booklet at the end. But degrowth is a very interesting approach that has been coming from Christian. I think, if I'm not wrong, Christian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
So yeah, that was brought forward by me because they have great collections of different examples
Exactly.
that also provide ideas that are a bit different to kind of the routines that we have.
Yeah. And also one more project I would like to pick up from the Miro board is Citizen Climate Convention in France. I'm not sure who has put it. Somebody wants to join in the conversation telling us something about this Citizen Climate Convention? Is it Thomas? Yes.
Well, I put the Citizen Climate Convention in it because it's what Maria Kijke mentioned about including parts of the population that are normally excluded from regulatory processes and planning. I thought of what they did and what they are now trying to achieve in France with the Citizen Climate Convention. It's a form of deliberative democracy where 150 citizens are selected based on their representativeness in the total population, and during the course of an entire year, they came together. They were given information and lectures, and they were actually the ones who had to come up with a strategy for making France more climate friendly. And then I think in June, they came out with their advice at the end of June. And so far this climate convention is the largest experiment in deliberative democracy. And most of its use has been in Ireland with legislating for issues that the parliament was not able to come to an agreement on.
Okay, agreed. That's a good example. I think that something also could be followed up later for even a learning for the new planning dialogue, how we can keep it. In terms of skills and capacities, I think somebody has put it in a very bold and big letters that don't talk in problems, talk in inspiring futures that help solve problems. So I think we, while discussing the new planning dialogue, has always been very positive about this discussion, and we don't want to give up hope. We still think that we can still make it right and still try to do it. We have seen the video at the beginning talking about the urgencies and have had a variety of discussions today coming from different backgrounds. It's interesting, but also at times it demotivates us that, okay, are we not doing anything right? Or how is it going on? But I think the new planning, through the new planning dialogue and through the cookbook that Paul has mentioned already, we would like to take a step ahead and say that no, there are inspiring projects that are happening around the world. And we would like to see what kind of alternatives can we pick up in the planning systems to actually make it work, to make it right. So at the end, I would like to ask Terry. I hope Terry is there. I cannot see him yet.
Yes, I just made it.
Yes, you just made it. And I would like to give the floor to Terry because he has a very interesting and enthusiastic thought as a closing statement for us.
No pressure there. No, I can just share what our intention was. Me and my colleague and the preparation team, we observed these trends in the planning debate that were often about fine-tuning. And then we often say to each other, let's not be naive. The challenges of our time are so massive. It's not about fine-tuning. It's not about being more inclusive to citizens. It's not about these little things. They are important and they bring us things. But my Lord, what is coming our way? And if we don't do this, if we don't feel it as our responsibility to cross boundaries, to connect, to integrate, to help generate these images, these inspiring new futures, then no one will. So we have to resume, we have to light the beacon, and like I said in the movie, and we have to take our responsibility of helping society make images where to go to. And just as was said just a minute before, don't stare in the headlights of these problems only, but start building on something sensible. And the visionlessness of the Dutch government and a lot of other governments are in ironic contrast to the immensity that everybody acknowledges about climate change and food crisis and housing crisis. We really have to start making images and perspectives instead of discussing the problems themselves. And that was the wake-up call we meant to convey through this afternoon with all these wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. Last question goes to Paul. Whatever expectation you had from this discussion, did it go in the right direction? Did you learn something today?
I learned that there's more work ahead, which is useless to say. No, I'm very happy with the conversation we had. I feel that we need to explore certain directions more thoroughly. I think a lot was mentioned also in the chat, and we will take that up more seriously. Yeah. I think we have to do better time management next time around. Then we would have maybe some time still to chat a bit, but I don't know if someone feels up to that still. However, I think I would like to invite you all to the next meeting on 21st of October in the context of the Week of the Regions. So that's actually quite interesting, because maybe perhaps we can also start this political debate a little bit further in that context. And I'm looking forward to maybe working with some of you on creating this new planning cookbook. So I would like to say a big thank you to all of you participating, either speaking or not, or contributing in the Miro board or in the chat. Or if you have some afterthoughts, you know how to reach us. So thank you very much, all of you, from my side.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you everyone for joining today. I hope everybody has enjoyed extremely as much as we did. Marcel Weiermans quoted while leaving that I'm still confused about the subject, but at a higher level. So I hope that's the same for all of us. So we still don't know what is the right solution. We still have to figure it out. So for that, we are keeping the Miro board open. Please feel free to keep sending us more examples over there, and keep telling us that how to actually reach to those skills and capacities. Thank you to all the speakers, Paul, Terry, Annette, Christian, Ward, and all our panel members. And especially I would like to thank some of my colleagues, Malvika, Thomas, and some volunteers from TU Delft who has been committedly participating in all the new planning dialogue. Kima, Kavya, Surbhi, thank you so much. We are almost heading to the end of the whole dialogue. So on the screen, you can already see the last dialogue for registration. So you can go visit our website to register. I'm closing. I'll take 1 minute before I close the meeting. If everybody is busy, then we leave the meeting right away. But if anybody is free for a short chat, there will be breakout rooms opening up. See you in the breakout room, Borrell. Bye. Thank you.